Let's look now at section 3.2 at the fallacies of relevance. Remember that a formal fallacy is detectable by analyzing the form of an argument, and an informal fallacy can be detected by analyzing the content of an argument. So all of the fallacies that we're looking at this semester have to do with or are informal fallacies. So each fallacy, each defect in the argument will be detectable by analyzing the content, not the form. So the first one is appeal to force in the section of fallacies of relevance. This is an argument in which, or a fallacy in which, an arguer poses a conclusion to another person and tells that person either implicitly or explicitly that some harm will come to him or her if she does not accept the conclusion. So basically, they're threatening the reader or listener to get them to accept their conclusion. Because it's not good argumentation to simply threaten someone into accepting your conclusion, that's the defect. So for example, if I said, Sesame Street is the best show on TV, and if you don't believe it, I'm going to call my big brother over here and he's going to beat you up, right? That's a physical threat. Accept my conclusion or I will physically harm you, is what that argument says. But it could occur among adults as well. It could be a psychological threat. A secretary could say to his or her boss, I deserve a raise in salary for the coming year. After all, you know how friendly I am with your wife, and I'm sure you wouldn't want her to find out what's been going on between you and that sexpot client of yours, right? So there's no evidence, it's just a threat. So that's appeal to force, very easy. Appeal to pity works in a similar way. This occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion, not by threatening, but by evoking pity from the reader or listener. So if a taxpayer said to a judge, Your Honor, I admit that I declared 13 children as dependents on my tax return, even though I only have 2. But if you find me guilty of tax evasion, my reputation will be ruined. I'll probably lose my job. My poor wife will not be able to have the operation she desperately needs, and my kids will starve. Surely I am not guilty. But because guilt and innocence has nothing to do with a person's life circumstances, the surely I'm not guilty is not logically relevant. The taxpayer is clearly trying to evoke pity. Students often do this with professors at the end of the semester. And if there's no good evidence, then to support their conclusion, then it is an appeal to pity. So the arguer is going to elicit pity from the reader or listener. Then there's also an appeal to the people. This appeal to the people, it could happen in 2 different ways. You don't need to know the direct or indirect approach, but you do need to know that each of these approaches is an appeal to the people. So either our desire for love, security, and respect could be appealed to, or someone could incite a mob mentality. So for example, the bandwagon argument, the appeal to snobbery, and the argument based on vanity will all fit into an appeal to the people, as will inciting a mob mentality. So if a person addressed a large group of people and excited their emotions and enthusiasm in order to win acceptance for their conclusion, and those people kept accepting more and more ridiculous conclusions simply because of the heat of the moment, then that would be an appeal to the people. With the bandwagon, vanity, and snobbery versions, that's an appeal to our desire for love, security, and respect, desires that most people, if not all people, have. So the bandwagon argument is, why don't you jump on the bandwagon? Of course, for example, you want to buy Zing toothpaste. Why 90% of America brushes with Zing. So the idea is that you will be left behind or left out of the group if you do not use the product. The appeal to vanity will often associate a product, it's often used in advertising, with someone who is admired, pursued, or imitated. And the idea is that you too will be admired and pursued if you use it. Your book gives an ad for the US Marine Corps, showing a strong, handsome man in uniform holding a gleaming sword, where the caption reads, "The few, the proud, the Marines," as an example. And the message is that if you join the Marines, then you too will be admired and respected. But any kind of advertisement that uses a celebrity or an influencer would fall into the same category. Is buying that particular item of clothing or beauty products going to make you look exactly like the celebrity or influencer? No. But that's what that appeal is based on, that if you use it, then you'll be just like the person you admire. And the appeal to snobbery depends on a similar kind of association. If I said a Rolls Royce is not for everyone, if you qualify as one of the select few, this distinguished classic may be seen and driven at British Motor Cars Limited by appointment only, please, then that's an appeal to being able to say that you're part of the elite, that you can be a snob to other people. What does it really take to buy a Rolls Royce? Do you have to qualify as one of the select few? Sure. How do you qualify as one of the select few? Well, you simply have enough money to buy the Rolls Royce, right? It doesn't take anything other than that. But saying by appointment only, making it exclusive, etc., that is the appeal to snobbery. The indirect approach can also be used by parents, right? Maybe it's an appeal to vanity. You want to grow up and be just like Wonder Woman, don't you? Then eat your liver and carrots. So you don't need to be able to distinguish between the bandwagon appeal to vanity and snobbery or the mob mentality. You just need to identify all of those as an appeal to the people. The fourth one, an argument against the person in this particular section, also may be more familiar to you as an ad hominem attack or an ad hominem fallacy. This is an argument in which, well, first of all, it always requires two arguers because someone has to be attacked. And one of them advances either directly or indirectly an argument, and the other arguer responds by directing their attention not to the first person's argument, but to the first person themselves. So that second person is said to commit an argument against the person. You don't need to know the difference between the ad hominem abusive or circumstantial, etc., but you do, again, need to know that they both fall into the same category. So again, the arguer is going to personally attack an opposing arguer by either verbally abusing them, or by, they could also do it by presenting the opponent as predisposed or biased to argue as they do, or by presenting the opponent as a hypocrite, which is the U2 or tu quoque version. So for example, if someone said, television entertainer Bill Maher argues that religion is just a lot of foolish nonsense, but Maher is an arrogant, shameless, self-righteous pig, obviously his arguments are not worth listening to. The person hasn't addressed Bill Maher's arguments about religion. They've only addressed their disgust or distaste with Bill Maher himself. You could, the tu quoque works in a different way. It basically says, if you do something, then you shouldn't say that other people can't. So for example, political operative Newt Gingrich has argued about the need to preserve family values. So that's the argument that we're dealing with, the need to preserve family values. But instead of going into the argument about family values that Newt Gingrich has argued, the second arguer says, but who is he to talk? Gingrich has been married 3 times. He divorced his first wife while she was hospitalized for cancer, and he engaged in an extramarital affair while he was married to his second wife. Clearly, Gingrich's arguments are trash. That's clearly an argument against the person and not against their argument. And in this case, it says, you too, or tu quoque in Latin, you too did it. Therefore, you shouldn't tell anybody else to do it. It's kind of like a relative who smokes telling you to stop smoking, and saying, you know, I don't think you should smoke. And you say, well, you smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Unfortunately, that's not a good argument. Someone being a hypocrite, you know, you can call them that for various other reasons, etc. But as far as logic is concerned, you would have to actually make an argument against their argument, right? And not against what they do or do not do personally. Okay. Accident, number 5, is committed. The fallacy of accident is committed when a general rule is accidentally applied to a specific case that it was not intended to cover. So usually the general rule will be cited. You know, the arguer will say, this is the general rule, and then incorrectly or wrongly applied to the specific case. So if I said freedom of speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right, Therefore, John Q. Radical should not be arrested for his speech that incited the riot last week. So the general rule is that it is true. Freedom of speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right in the United States, but there is an exception to citing or inciting rather a riot. So citing or inciting a riot is not covered by free speech. So it's a general rule applied to a specific case that it was not intended to cover. One of the best examples of this is actually in one of the exercises. It's number 4 in exercise 3.2. Whoever thrusts a knife into another person should be arrested. That's the general rule that they're citing. But surgeons do precisely this when operating, therefore surgeons should be arrested. So clearly the general rule of not stabbing someone else, right, is not supposed to be or meant to be covered by surgeons, right, or applied to surgeons. So that general rule is being accidentally applied incorrectly. Okay, and then we've got the straw man fallacy, which is when an arguer distorts an opponent's argument and then attacks the distorted argument. Again, there must be 2 arguers here. So what they're doing is distorting the argument for the purposes of more easily attacking it, demolishing the fake argument that they've created or the distortion that they've created, and claiming that they've destroyed the original argument. So if I said, Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in the public schools, obviously Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in Russia. Atheism leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for our country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. But you see, they've distorted Mr. Goldberg's arguments, which we still don't know very much about being against prayer in the public schools, into an argument about him advocating atheism. So they have distorted the argument about prayer in public schools to be one about atheism, attacked the idea of atheism, and claimed to have actually attacked Mr. Goldberg's original argument against prayer in the public schools. If I said also, the Student Status Committee has presented us with an argument favoring alcohol privileges on campus, what do the students want? Is it their intention to stay boozed up from the day they enter as freshmen until the day they graduate? Do they expect us to open a bar for them, or maybe a chain of bars all over campus? Such a proposal is ridiculous. That's a distortion. The Student Status Committee probably wants to have alcohol privileges on campus for particular events. They're not it's very unlikely that they're asking for this distortion that the second arguer presents us with, that what they really want is to stay quote unquote boozed up from the day they enter as freshmen, and they want, bars opened on campus, etc. That's a distortion, not the real argument. And let's skip missing the point for just a minute and go to red herring, because it's so similar to the straw man that I want to point it out. So the red herring is associated with missing the point, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's committed when the arguer leads the reader or listener completely off the track, usually by changing the subject to a different but similar or sometimes subtly related one. And then he or she finishes finishes by either drawing a conclusion about this different issue or by merely presuming that some conclusion has been established. The easiest way to remember this fallacy is to think about the actual name. It comes from a process used to train hunting dogs to follow a scent. So they would take a bag of red fish and drag it across a particular path. And the path that they really wanted the hunting dogs to follow would be here, right? For example, so the test was, could the dogs resist the heavy smell of the fish and follow the correct scent? So when someone uses a red herring, they're trying to draw you off of the correct track. And a good way to tell the difference between these two, red herring and straw man, these two fallacies are often confused because they both have the same effect of drawing the reader or listener off track, but they do it in two unique ways. The straw man distorts the opponent's argument, right? So if this stick man represents the real argument, it gets distorted into a straw version. That straw version gets destroyed, and they say, hey, I've destroyed the real argument, when in fact they've only destroyed the distortion. But the red herring does not distort, it ignores the original argument, and it subtly changes the subject to, again, lead you off track with that bag of stinky fish, if you want to think about it that way. And then the last one for this section is missing the point. Missing the point is a very specific thing, a very specific type of fallacy. It's a catch-all fallacy. The arguer is drawing a conclusion that's different from the one supported by the premises. So very important, do not cite this fallacy if another fallacy fits. So be very careful about that when taking a test. So let's give an example of that. If I said, crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty immediately. You say, wait a minute, crimes of theft and robbery don't really get associated with the death penalty unless there's also a murder. So that doesn't seem to make sense. The conclusion is not supported by the premises. And let me give you also an example of the red herring, because I've forgotten to do that. Here's an example. If I said, environmentalists are continually harping about the dangers of nuclear power. Okay, so there's the original track. But electricity is dangerous no matter where it comes from. So see, they're drawing you off the track with that argument about electricity. Every year, hundreds of people are electrocuted by accidents. And since most of these accidents are caused by carelessness, they could be avoided if people would just exercise greater caution. So again, it's ignored the argument and made an argument about some other subject. And those are the fallacies of relevance.